Most people capable of hearing these words don't really need to imagine what division looks like. We just need to take a look outside. I mean, if I've calculated the timing correctly, this sermon should be uploaded mid-October 2024. And in America, at least, we still have a few more weeks of certain divisions getting worse. And that's to say nothing about the months and years that follow, regardless of who it is that takes control of a particular American office. Those within my typical purview of example, namely nerd culture, are also familiar with the idea of division. You can hardly dodge a story of rebel freedom fighters versus an evil empire. The old meme of Marvel versus DC still gets mentioned from time to time, and tales of civil war where the two sides have differing opinions about a very delicate situation have been told and retold. If I didn't know any better, I'd just assume that dividing ourselves into disparate groups was intrinsic to what it means to be human. We are much more likely to define ourselves based off of what differentiates us than what unites us. And this is true in both fiction and nonfiction, today and in history. Even our passage for this sermon, 2 Samuel chapter 2, shows people dividing. But as I seek to explain and apply this passage to us as we continue our series A Song of Failures and Hope, I feel the need to choose my words and examples very carefully. I say this because when it comes to the discussion of division in 2 Samuel chapter 2, there's a third party on board who has obviously joined one side over the other. Sure, with our political, social, and ideological divisions, many may claim to have the divine or future history on their side. But that has a very different backing than a prophet's anointing at the command of God. And so I want to make sure as we look and apply at this passage, we're not staring across the aisle with nods of, "You tell them, because we've got God on our side." Let's not be like that. Rather, let's look at our own failings and working alongside God with His plan of restoration for His humble people. If we must see it as two sides, let's question whether we're on the side of restoration or the side of human evil that brings about trouble and difficulties in this world, and ask which of the two sides we ourselves are on, instead of declaring that someone else is on the wrong side. Because the truth is, we might not like the answer of which side we're actually on. And it's not like it's a one-time deal either. We have to ask ourselves this question repeatedly. Because even if we have proof of being on the side of God's restoration in one moment, that doesn't mean that we haven't failed at it in many others. I mean, while David shows himself as joining God in his work of restoration as God's chosen king, those who serve under him will prove that they are just as quick to create trouble as those opposed to God's chosen king. So let's look at the passage, viewing the two sides from three different angles, and see what happens when we divide ourselves toward the path of human evil. And we begin with the sudden appearance of two kings. 2 Samuel chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. After this, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah?" And the Lord said to him, "Go up." David said, "To which shall I go up?" And he said, "To Hebron." So David went up there, and his two wives also, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David brought up his men who were with him, everyone with his household, and they lived in the towns of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. When they told David, it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul. David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, "May you be blessed by the Lord, because you showed this loyalty to Saul your lord, and buried him. Now may the Lord show steadfast love and faithfulness to you, and I will do good to you because you have done this thing. Now therefore let your hands be strong and be valiant, for Saul your lord is dead, and the house of Judah has anointed me king over them." But Abner the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. And he made him king over Gilead, and the Asherites, and Jezreel, and Ephraim, and Benjamin, and all Israel. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. But the house of Judah followed David, and the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. I want us to notice the way a person acts when they join God in his work of restoration. We see it in the very first verse of this chapter. Remember, David knew that God had anointed him as king over Israel. There was just one thing standing in his way: Saul. But David didn't grasp at being king. He didn't plot and connive for the death of Israel's rejected king. No, he waited for God to provide the way. And just recently in the book, Saul has died. Knowledge of that death had just reached David. The only real obstacle in the way of his ascension to the throne had been removed. But he doesn't go running back to the Israelites with arms open going, "Now everybody bow to your king." No, he humbly bows before the God who had anointed him and asks, "Is this the time to move? Is now the time to take the throne that you have promised me, God? This is the underlying thought to his question, shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah? He doesn't just expect his role in the restorative plan of God. He asks for guidance, just as we should. It's a place of humility, a humble nature that's required to bring restoration to God's people. Not pride, not self-service, but a willingness to move when and only when God gives the command. So David asks his questions to the God-ordained Urim and Thummim, and he receives the answers that he is to go up to Judah, specifically to Hebron. Hebron is a city smack dab in the middle of the tribal lands of Judah, centrally located for the southernmost tribe, but not so much for the rest of Israel's lands. It's about 20 miles south of Jerusalem if you have a map of Israel in your mind. And notice that verses 2 and 3 show us that it's David's intention to fully rejoin Israelite society. He brought both of his wives along with him, and had the families of those who followed him all leave Ziklag. He no longer worked for the king of Gath, and Israel would be no vassal state to the Philistines. This God-chosen king would reign under only the oversight of Yahweh. It is here in Hebron that the people of Judah anoint David as king. They join God in following his choice of human king over them. And starting in the second half of verse 4, we see that not only does a person who joins God's work of restoration humbly seek God's advice, but they also show covenant loyalty to those who have also worked the ways of restoration in the world. The elders of Judah tell David that the men of Jabesh-Gilead took and buried Saul's body. What it is that the elders expect David to do is beyond me. But what David does is both humble and politically wise. Remember, the people of Jabesh-Gilead risked Philistine wrath to bury Saul and his sons because they were staunch defenders of Saul's reign. It was his rescue of their town that initiated Saul's acts as king of Israel. If there was anywhere that could be considered the most pro-Saul, it was Jabesh-Gilead, even over Saul's hometown and seeming political capital, Gibeah. Thus, when David humbly sends word to Jabesh-Gilead, speaking of God's blessing being upon them because they acted in covenant loyalty towards Saul, he's showing them that he bore no ill will toward the man who chased him around the countryside, effectively exiling David from Israel. See, a man who reviled Saul would attempt to defile his grave, not bless those who secreted the body away to bury it, and he certainly wouldn't call more blessing from Yahweh to be upon them. This move was performed in humility by a man who wished to show covenant loyalty to Saul, regardless of how well that covenant loyalty was returned to him by Saul. But it was also a wise political move. David extended his offer of protection to the people of Jabesh-Gilead just as Saul had. They didn't need to fear that just because Saul was dead that the new king would leave them to fend for themselves. The next king, anointed and chosen by God, was there to continue that very same covenant of protection. Just because the dynasty has changed doesn't mean that God's plan of restoration has. David's vocabulary in both verses 6 and 7 draws from the history of Israel as a people. 2 moments of new beginnings. In verse 6 he speaks of Yahweh blessing them with his steadfast love and faithfulness. It brings to mind Exodus chapter 34 verse 6, where God provided his self-proclaimed biography, part of which is that he is a God abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. It was spoken to Moses on Mount Sinai during the formation of Israel as God's chosen people. And in 2 Samuel chapter 2 verse 7, David's call for the people of Jabesh-Gilead to let their hands be strong, for them to be valorous sons of might. They are reminders of God's call to Joshua just before entering the promised land. Be strong and courageous. In both of these moments, when Israel is first formed as a nation, and right before the nation goes to get the land that God promised them, speaking for both of these moments, David is saying that this is a new beginning in God's plan of restoration for his humble people. This new dynasty means a new beginning, one that God had planned from long ago. And David is calling even those who are the staunchest defenders of Saul to join him as he follows God in this new endeavor, this new beginning for the land of Israel. The offer is open, free of restitution or complaint, for any who humble themselves to the work of God's plan to bring about restoration. Technically, we don't get the response from the people of Jabesh-Gilead. We don't know what they said. The verses don't tell us if they accepted or rejected David's offered hand. But verses 8 to 10 do speak of the choice of those who seek the way of division from God's restoration. Those who seek to make their own kind of restoration, a kind that leads only to death and destruction. In those verses, we see Abner, the general who served under his cousin Saul, take Saul's last surviving son and make him king. Notice how we see the differences, even in the English, between the manners in which the two kings were crowned. David was anointed as king by both God and the elders of Judah, but Ishbosheth was made king by his father's cousin, more of a puppet king than a humble servant for restoration. This makes me wonder if it was actually Abner who longed for Saul's throne. He found a way to obtain it through a weak heir. That's the tendency for people who look to their own self-interest over the welfare of everybody else. All they care about is getting a little bit more ahead for themselves. Any possible weakness they can exploit gives them their opportunity. I mean, think about it. We've seen through the series that even Saul himself had come to the conclusion that David would be the one who would rule after him. And Jonathan, the crowned prince, had deferred his right to rule to David. Who else is closer to this royal pair than the main general of Saul's army? So for Abner to make the claim that Ishbosheth should be made king was nothing more than political maneuverings for his own advancement. What's better than being a general for the nation? Being the man behind the weak puppet king who only achieved that position because of your support. Yeah, the king who owes you, that's a better place to be, isn't it? If only you seek your own advancement. But the 11 tribes other than Judah followed Ishbosheth, a man whose name literally means son of shame. Granted, that probably wasn't his actual name, but rather Ishbaal, which means man of Baal, or man of the Lord. Basically, a lordly man. But the purpose for the name change is insignificant to the point here. When we reject the restorative plan of God given through his chosen king, we're doing nothing other than making a power play for the throne that belongs to God. And we can bring others, even whole nations, along with us down the path of trouble, pain, and destruction. A heart set for only our own advancement is a heart set towards division, toward the human evils that bring about the troubles and difficulties of this life. It is only a humble heart that leads us to God's promised restoration, a heart that doesn't seek our own advancement, but the betterment of others around us. And as I said before, we must continue to check our own hearts for continued humility, because even though we've followed God's commands before, it doesn't mean that we always will. We see this proven as we take a look at the 2 generals of the 2 kings. 2 Samuel chapter 2, verses 12 to 16. Abner, the son of Ner, and the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out and met them in the pool of Gibeon. And they sat down, one on the one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. And Abner said to Joab, "Let the young men arise and compete before us." And Joab said, "Let them arise." Then they arose and passed over by number 12 for Benjamin and Ishbosheth the son of Saul, and 12 for the servants of David. And each caught his opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side. So they fell down together. Therefore that place was called Helkath Hazurim, which is at Gibeon. Sometime during the 2-year reign of Ishbosheth and the 7.5 years of David's reign in Hebron, the 2 armies met each other in a place called Gibeon. It's not clear if Abner's trying to solidify Ishbosheth's power, and it could be that David's men under the leadership of Joab were trying to free some of the land from Philistine rule. Because remember, when the Philistines had killed Saul, it was during an offensive campaign that essentially split the nation of Israel in half. Both Joab and Abner would be leading their respective armies to aid the purposes of their kings. But what we do know, because the passage tells us, is that the 2 generals led their armies to the same city, to the same watering hole even. I can't help but wonder if Joab saw the moment as funny. Abner's army on one side of something, while Joab's army was on the other side. It wasn't the first time they'd been in that type of position before. Only this time, Joab was the general leading the anointed king's army. Either way, it seems that Abner calls out to Joab. He asks if it would be better for them to have a champion battle instead of a full-blown conflict. Both sides have something to do here in Gibeon, and fighting the other side wasn't really the main mission for either. But I want us to notice that Joab isn't David. Joab does not seek God's will in this competition. Never asks if it's the right thing to do. Joab merely assumes that he's on the right side because he's on the side of David. So no matter what he chooses, it'll be the right option, right? He proves his pride when he agrees to this ridiculous contest without a thought. He seems to only take time to crack his knuckles before saying, "Let's do this." So each side chose 12 warriors. Champion warfare is often done one-on-one, such as David and Goliath's fight. And such events could use a small number of warriors. But this choice of 12 seems to indicate that they were wagering for the whole nation, all 12 tribes, on the results of this skirmish. They purposefully forged God's signature on this choice by using the number specific to God's chosen nation. And in verse 16, we see that all 24 men took hold of their opponent and killed each other. Not a single one survived. Both sides failed. It makes me wonder if this was God's sign that neither side would have the victory to hold over the other. David might be God's chosen king, but Yahweh wasn't playing this measuring contest between the two generals who are more interested in their own glory than God's restoration. Two generals who play at their games at the expense of human lives. God don't play that game. But there's one more thing about verse 16's vocabulary that I find more interesting than the general's power play. Even more than the oddity of multiple reciprocal stabbings. And this time the English translation does gloss over the interesting wording. When the verse says that each man caught his opponent, and each thrust his sword in his opponent's side, the word translated as opponent is the Hebrew word for friend, comrade, compatriot. These aren't enemies killing each other. This is family taken to mutual harm. People who should be working side by side, bringing God's plan of restoration to bear. Not fighting one against the other to assured mutual destruction. Civil wars mean friend against friend, brother against brother. It means that there has been a failure to humbly seek God's restoration. Nothing should be a higher calling than the restorative plan of God, His work that He brings about through Jesus. There should be no group, sociological, political, hereditary, or any other type of group by which we divide ourselves. None should bear more of our attention than the kingdom of God that brings restoration to God's humble people. As we consider this, let's not go thinking about some other group of people who've been doing this, or some specific individual. Blaming them, condemning them, calling them out for being hypocrites. We each have enough of that for ourselves. When you or I seek something other than the restoration granted to us by God, we do nothing other than divide, hate, and destroy. We create the Helkath Hazurim, the field of hostilities. We don't bring the restoration of God. Rather, we bring the troubles and difficulties of this life. We create the selfishness of human evil. So when I say that we should unite under the banner of our restorative God, instead of any other division of people groups, it's not just me asking if we can all get along. It's a call for us to join the one we follow in His plan of restoration. A call for us to stop skipping along the path that leads only to hostility, to mutually assured destruction. That path leads to nothing but death, as we see with this little competition as it becomes a full-scale battle. And we see the two armies come to mourn their dead. 2 Samuel chapter 2, verses 17 to 32. And the battle was very fierce that day, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. And the 3 sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Now Asahel was as swift of foot as a wild gazelle. And Asahel pursued Abner, and as he went he turned neither to the right hand nor to the left from following Abner. Then Abner looked behind him and said, "Is it you, Asahel?" And he answered, "It is I." Abner said to him, "Turn aside to your right hand or to your left, and seize one of the young men and take his spoil." But Asahel would not turn aside from following him. And Abner again said to Asahel, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I lift up my face to your brother Joab?" But he refused to turn aside. Therefore Abner struck him in the stomach with the butt of his spear, so that the spear came out at his back. And he fell there and died where he was. And all who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died stood still. But Joab and Abishai pursued Abner. And as the sun was going down, they came to the hill of Ammah, which lies before Giah, on the way to the wilderness of Gibeon. And the people of the Benjamites gathered themselves together behind Abner, and became one group, and took their stand at the top of the hill. Then Abner called to Joab, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that the end will be bitter? How long will it be before you tell your people to turn from the pursuit of their brothers?" And Joab said, "As God lives, if you had not spoken, surely the men would not have given up the pursuit of their brothers until the morning." So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the men stopped and pursued Israel no more, nor did they fight any more. And Abner and his men went all that night through the Arabah. They crossed the Jordan, and marching the whole morning, they came to Mahanaim. Joab returned from the pursuit of Abner. And when he had gathered all the people together, there were missing of David's servants 19 men besides Asahel. But the servants of David had struck down of Benjamin 360 of Abner's men. And they took up Asahel, and buried him in the tomb of his father, which is at Bethlehem. And Joab and his men marched all night, and the day broke upon them at Hebron. As each side's 12 men fell for nothing, a bigger battle broke out, and the battle favored the men under Joab. Verse 18 gives us a little background on some names that might get all jumbled up in our heads. It speaks to the sons of Zeruiah, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. For our better understanding, let's just think of them as David's nephews, which is what they were. But they were also among David's greatest warriors. Joab is the general, of course. We've met Abishai before. He's the one who went with David into Saul's camp when they'd been on the run. The one who asked his uncle David if he could be the one to thrust through Saul with his spear. But this is the first time that we've heard of Asahel, the third brother. He was the speedster of the group, and he set his sights on using that speed for a little headhunting. It seems that personal glory-seeking was common among the brothers. With all sorts of other fighting going on, Asahel only wanted the head honcho of Israel's army himself. Nothing other than Abner would do. At first, Abner just tried to stay ahead of the young speedster. But that wasn't happening. So Abner tried to distract Asahel. "There are plenty of other trophies you can take, Asahel." But the fleet-footed man did not take the bait. So Abner begins to tell him that this pursuit would end poorly for Asahel. And how could Abner ever hope to look Joab in the eye again if he killed his brother? But the glory-seeking nephew still refused. So Abner makes a sudden stop with the butt of his spear meant for Asahel's gut. But the somewhat pointed end pierces the speedster's body. I'm not sure if Abner only meant for the blow to knock the wind out of the other man, or if he actually meant to kill him. But now the deed was done. Blood had been spilled, and death swiftly followed. Most who came upon the body of Asahel paused for a moment. One of the greatest of David's warriors had fallen. His speed had failed him. But while many mourned Asahel, Joab and Abishai only saw red. There was no longer a veneer of being on the right side. They just wanted blood. Abner's blood. Right now. The pair of brothers bolstered their army against the army of the rest of Israel. With the sun swiftly setting around them, the remnants of Abner's army gathered to a cohesive unit on the top of a hill. Apparently, they believed in the high ground. With Joab and Abishai and their army hot on their heels, Abner calls out for a ceasefire. Yeah, sure, the instigator finds themselves on the losing side and then they call for peace. The fleshly side of me rolls my eyes incredibly hard at that. And I'm not sure if Abner was trying to bait Joab into more fighting, or if Abner just made a huge blunder in his vocabulary. But I don't think that the way to speak about the stupidity of this civil war was to call each other brothers, after he had just literally killed their brother. Wrong time to speak that way about the Israelite family connections, Abner. Amazingly, though, the thought struck Joab the right way. But don't believe for a moment that Joab is ever going to forget who killed his brother. Joab calls for the army of Judah to cease. It was a rather stupid thing to divide themselves in such a way as to consider each other enemies instead of family. If Abner hadn't called for this momentary peace, Joab and his men would have cut down the entirety of Abner's army. But because of it, they found a moment of peace. Only once they put aside their differences, they put aside the different opinions and the different kings, only then would they stop the fighting, and each go home through the night. But of course, that's not before Joab had the dead counted. 360 men of Ishbosheth died, and 20 of the men of David. 18-1 odds isn't bad, but Joab didn't celebrate it as a victory. He and Abishai grieved the loss of their brother Asahel. The ramifications of division hit harder when it became personal to them, when their self-centered pursuit of being on the right side brought not only death and destruction, but the death and destruction of their brother. This is the thing about division. Any attempt to choose something other than God's plan of restoration will lead to death. We don't really think about it all that much when we choose a different path. It all seems good to us, fun and exciting, but the ramifications will always lead to death and destruction, our own or that of a loved one, hurting ourselves or those we care about. When we divide ourselves away from the restoration of God's plan, there will always come a time of mourning. There were 2 kings, whose 2 generals brought each of their 2 armies to battle, but all left mourning their dead. So which is more important to us? Dividing into socio-political groups based off of gender, race, and personal preference? Or the restoration of God? Only one leads to life. That is the one which calls us to stop our self-centeredness. The one which calls us to something better and more godly than we are in our fleshly desires. The one which remembers that God's chosen people should not be at war against their brothers and sisters. We can unite with God and the restoration He brings. Or we can unite in mourning our losses. The choice is ours.